Alistair Sterling was one of the richest men in the world, a titan of industry whose name was synonymous with ruthless efficiency and staggering success. His penthouse overlooked a city that bent to his will, his portfolio shaped global markets, and his influence reached into the highest echelons of power. But no amount of money could fix his daughter. After firing 7 of the country's most sought-after pediatric specialists and an equal number of highly trained caregivers, his desperation had curdled into a cold, hard knot of despair. His 8-year-old daughter, Lily, remained a silent statue in a gilded cage, diagnosed with a severe psychosomatic paralysis that had stolen her voice and her movement since the day her mother died. Just when Alistair was about to surrender to the void that had consumed his home, a quiet woman with a painful past of her own arrived, not for the role of caregiver, but of housekeeper. She would set in motion a series of events that would uncover a devastating truth and lead to a shocking moment in a hushed courtroom that broke him completely, shattering the fortress around his heart and rebuilding his world from the ashes. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. The Sterling mansion was less a home and more a mausoleum. Polished marble floors reflected the cold, recessed lighting with unnerving precision. Art, curated for investment rather than enjoyment, hung on stark white walls. The air itself felt sterile, filtered of all life, all scent, all warmth. It was a monument to grief, meticulously maintained. Into this silent world stepped Ilara Vance. She was not like the others who had come and gone. She didn't carry a briefcase full of credentials or speak in the confident clinical tones of the medical elite. She carried a simple cloth bag and a stillness that seemed to absorb the house's oppressive silence rather than be crushed by it. There were shadows in her own eyes, a deep, abiding sorrow that Alistair recognized, for it was a mirror to his own. He'd hired her against the advice of his staff. They wanted another specialist. He was tired of specialists. He saw in Ilara's quiet dignity a kind of resignation that felt, oddly, like a relief. She wouldn't promise miracles. She would just clean. Her duties were explicit and extensive, outlined in a multi-page document by a brisk administrative assistant. Dust, polish, vacuum, scrub. Never disturb Mr. Sterling, never interact with the child's medical staff, and above all, remain invisible. For the first few days, Ilara complied perfectly. She moved through the vast, empty rooms like a ghost, her presence marked only by the gleam of a newly polished surface or the faint clean scent of lemon oil. She learned the rhythms of the house, the hushed arrival of the morning nurse, the solemn afternoon visit from Dr. Adrian Finch, the muffled sounds of Alistair's voice on conference calls from his locked study, and the profound, unending silence from Lily's wing of the house. It was on the 4th day that she saw the child. Ilara was polishing the floor-to-ceiling windows in the grand solarium. A glass-walled room that overlooked a meticulously manicured English garden. In the center of the room, positioned to catch the morning sun, was a state-of-the-art wheelchair. And in it, a small, fragile figure, Lily Sterling. Her dark curls were brushed to a sheen, her dress was a confection of pristine white lace, but her body was utterly still. Her head was tilted slightly, her dark eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the manicured lawns, their expression vacant. In her lap, her small hands were curled loosely around a single object, a small, worn wooden bird, its paint faded and its edges smoothed by years of touch. The nurse, a stern woman named Ingrid, was checking vitals on a tablet, her movements efficient and devoid of emotion. Ilara continued her work, her back to the scene, but her senses were heightened. She could feel the tension in the room, the sterile lack of connection between the nurse and the child. She worked her way around the perimeter, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the marble. As she reached the far side of the solarium, A flash of crimson caught her eye. A hummingbird, a tiny jewel of frantic energy, had appeared at the window, hovering for a moment before a large hibiscus bloom. It was a fleeting, beautiful intrusion of life into the sterile space. Elara's gaze instinctively flicked from the bird to the child. The nurse hadn't noticed. Her attention was on her screen, but Elara saw it, a flicker. In the hand holding the wooden bird, Lily's fingers had twitched. It was a minuscule, almost imperceptible contraction, a brief clenching that lasted no more than a second. But it had happened. It was a definite, voluntary movement in a child the world had declared paralyzed by grief. It was a crack in the perfect tragic narrative. And in that silent, sun-filled room, Elara Vance, the invisible housekeeper, knew with a certainty that shook her to her core that everyone was wrong about Lily Sterling. The diagnosis, the prognosis, the entire funereal performance of her care, it was all built on a lie. And the quiet observer had just found the first loose thread. Elara did not speak of what she saw. To whom would she report it? To the cold Nurse Ingrid, who treated Lily like a delicate piece of machinery? To the distant, grieving Mr. Sterling, a man who seemed walled off from the world by his own pain? To do so would be to invite dismissal, to be labeled as fanciful, or, worse, dangerously presumptuous. She was the housekeeper. Her observations were not solicited, nor would they be welcome. So she kept the knowledge locked away, a secret ember in the cold expanse of the Sterling mansion. But the ember glowed, and it changed the nature of her work. Her duties were no longer just about cleaning. They were a cover for a silent, patient investigation. She began to orchestrate her chores with a new purpose. When she dusted the furniture in Lily's room, she did so with a deliberate slowness, her movements a quiet ballet of observation. She noted the precise arrangement of the sterile medical equipment, the unchanged expression on Lily's face as the nurse administered her medications, the way the child's gaze seemed to retreat inward whenever Dr. Finch entered the room. The doctor was a man of impeccable reputation, his manner a smooth blend of professional sympathy and clinical authority. He would speak to Lily in gentle, condescending tones, explaining his procedures to a child he clearly believed could not understand. "Just a little pressure now, Lily," he would murmur while checking her reflexes, which never responded. "See? Nothing to be afraid of." But Elara saw something else. She saw the subtle tightening of Lily's jaw, a tension so faint it would be invisible to anyone not looking for it. Lily wasn't absent. She was hiding. She was a prisoner in her own body, and Elara suspected her captors wore lab coats. Elara's experiments began, small and gentle, woven into the fabric of her daily routine. One day, while tending to the flowers in the solarium, she accidentally dropped a single, vibrant marigold onto the tray of Lily's wheelchair. She murmured a soft apology to the empty air and left it there. When she returned an hour later, after Nurse Ingrid had taken Lily for her scheduled sensory therapy in another room, the marigold was gone. There was no other explanation. Lily must have taken it, hidden it somewhere in the folds of her blanket. The next day, Elara started humming. It was a simple, wordless melody, a lullaby her own mother had sung to her, a tune steeped in a forgotten warmth. She hummed it while she polished the silver, while she wiped down the windows, while she folded the laundry. She never hummed it directly at Lily, but always within earshot, letting the notes drift into the child's silent world like seeds on the wind. From Alistair's perspective, the house was running more smoothly than ever before. The new housekeeper was efficient, unobtrusive, and utterly professional. He was a man, drowning in the logistics of his empire, using 18-hour workdays as an anesthetic against the relentless throb of grief. The reports from Dr. Finch remained unchanged. "Lily's condition is stable. We must remain patient. Trauma of this magnitude takes years to heal, if ever." The words were a familiar litany of hopelessness, and Alistair had learned to accept them. He rarely saw his daughter. The sight of her, so still and silent, was a physical manifestation of his greatest failure. He had conquered the world but could not save his own family. He hadn't protected his wife, Helena, from the sudden, vicious illness that had claimed her, and he couldn't bring his daughter back from the silent abyss she had fallen into afterward. So he retreated to his study, the one place where he felt competent, and let the specialists handle the rest. He signed the checks, approved the treatments, and tried not to think about the vibrant, laughing little girl who had once filled these sterile halls with joy. He was unaware of the quiet revolution taking place under his own roof, of the humming housekeeper, and the secret of the missing marigold. He saw only a clean house and the crushing static reality of his loss. Ilara, meanwhile, continued her patient work. She started talking to Lily, her voice a low, gentle murmur that never demanded a response. When she was alone in a room with the child, she would describe the world outside the windows. "The wind is picking up now," she'd whisper while dusting a bookshelf. "It's making the roses dance. They look like little ladies in red dresses, bowing to each other." She spoke of colors, scents, and textures, painting a world of sensation for a child trapped in stillness. She spoke of memories, not specific ones, but feelings, the warmth of sun on skin, the taste of a fresh strawberry, the comfort of a soft blanket. She was building a bridge of words, a fragile span reaching across a chasm of silence, hoping for some sign that someone was on the other side. One afternoon, as she was describing a fat, bumbling bee exploring a lavender bush, she noticed Lily's eyes were not fixed on their usual empty point in the distance. They were focused on the window, tracking the bee's clumsy flight. It was another small miracle, another piece of evidence that the soul inside the silent girl was very much alive and listening. The first significant crack in the ice came on a Tuesday, a day heavy with the promise of rain. Nurse Ingrid was on her lunch break, and Ilara was tidying Lily's room. On impulse, she filled a small porcelain bowl with lukewarm water from the adjoining bathroom. She carried it over to Lily's wheelchair, and with a heart that beat a nervous rhythm against her ribs, she knelt beside the child. "I thought you might like to feel the water," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's warm, like a bath." She gently took Lily's left hand, the one that didn't clutch the wooden bird. The fingers were cool and limp. Slowly, carefully, Ilara dipped them into the water. For a long moment there was nothing. Lily's expression remained placid, her gaze distant. Ilara's hope began to falter. Perhaps she had imagined everything. Perhaps this was a foolish, dangerous overstep. She was about to pull the child's hand away when she felt it. A tremor. It was followed by a slow, deliberate uncurling of the fingers, a stretching motion, as if waking from a long sleep. Lily's fingers moved in the water, tentatively at first, then with more purpose, brushing against the smooth sides of the bowl. Ilara held her breath, tears stinging her eyes. It wasn't a reflex. It wasn't a twitch. It was a conscious, voluntary action. Lily was feeling the water. She kept the child's hand submerged for another minute, her own hand trembling before gently drying it and placing it back in her lap, just as Nurse Ingrid's footsteps sounded in the hall. Ilara returned the bowl to the bathroom, her mind reeling. The proof was undeniable. The second breakthrough, the one that sealed Ilara's conviction, came 2 days later. She was in the solarium, dusting the leaves of a large fiddly fig, humming her simple, repetitive lullaby. She was lost in the melody, in the memories it evoked of a different child, a different life. A pain she kept buried deep. She finished her task and turned to leave the room when she heard it. A sound. It was faint, airy, and impossibly fragile, like the whisper of wind through a keyhole. Ilara froze, straining to hear it again. It came once more, a single breathy note, perfectly in tune with the last note of her lullaby. A hum. It had come from Lily. Ilara's world seemed to tilt on its axis. She turned slowly, her movements measured, not wanting to startle the child. Lily was in her usual position, her eyes fixed on the garden, but there was a new softness around her mouth, a subtle relaxation of the tension that always held her features in a mask of indifference. Ilara's first instinct was to rush to her, to cry out, to celebrate this monumental victory, but she held back, her intuition screaming at her to be still. Acknowledging the sound might frighten Lily back into her shell. Instead, Ilara simply took a deep breath and began to hum again, her voice thick with unshed tears. She continued the melody as she walked out of the room, leaving the notes hanging in the air behind her, a shared secret between the observer and the observed. That evening, as Nurse Ingrid was preparing Lily for bed, something else happened. The nurse was transferring Lily from her wheelchair to her bed, a routine she performed with detached efficiency. Ilara was in the hallway collecting linens. As the nurse turned her back for a moment to adjust the pillows, Ilara saw Lily's hand, the one that always held the wooden bird, move with a slow, deliberate motion. She reached out and pushed the little bird off her lap, letting it fall silently onto the plush carpet beside her bed. It was a clear, unambiguous gesture, a dismissal. But a few minutes later, after the nurse had left and the room was quiet, Ilara slipped back in. She picked up the wooden bird and placed it on the bedside table, within Lily's line of sight. She then sat in a chair in the corner of the room, waiting. After several long minutes, Lily's arm moved again. With painstaking effort, she reached out, her fingers stretching, straining, until they brushed against the bird. She couldn't quite grasp it, but the intention was unmistakable. She hadn't been discarding the bird. She had been trying to place it somewhere safe for the night. And in a silent moment of profound trust, as Ilara watched from the shadows, Lily turned her head on the pillow and her eyes met Ilara's. There was no vacancy in them now. There was only a deep, weary, and knowing intelligence, a silent plea, a shared understanding. This was their alliance, forged in silence and sealed with a hum and a wooden bird. Alistair Sterling's days were a blur of numbers and negotiations, a relentless tide of data that kept the shores of his grief from being breached. He came home late, long after the medical staff had departed, to a house that was impeccably clean and profoundly empty. He would pour a glass of scotch, stand before the large portrait of his late wife, Helena, that hung in the foyer, and allow himself a few moments of raw, unadulterated pain before retreating to the fortress of his study. He measured his daughter's life in the sterile, one-line email updates from Dr. Finch. No change. It was a mantra of failure. He trusted the doctor implicitly. Finch had been Helena's physician as well, a pillar of calm and competence during the terrifyingly swift illness that had taken her. He had become a trusted family advisor, the only one who seemed to understand the depths of Alistair's loss. This routine shattered on a Thursday. A multi-billion-dollar merger he had been orchestrating for months had collapsed at the final hour due to an unforeseen regulatory hurdle. He was incensed, his frustration a volatile acid in his veins. He left the office hours earlier than usual, needing the cold silence of his home to recalibrate. As he walked through the grand entryway, he was struck by an unfamiliar sound. It was faint, but clear. A woman's voice humming a soft, simple tune. It was coming from the direction of the garden. Annoyance pricked at him. The staff had strict instructions about noise. He followed the sound, his footsteps silent on the marble floors. The humming led him to the French doors of the solarium, which stood slightly ajar. He stopped in the shadows of the hallway, peering through the gap. The scene before him made him freeze. Ilara, the housekeeper, was sitting on the grass just outside the open doors, a few feet from Lily's wheelchair. She wasn't touching the child. She was arranging a small bouquet of wildflowers, her head bent to her task, the gentle melody spilling from her lips. But it was Lily who held Alistair's gaze, who made the air leave his lungs in a silent rush. Her wheelchair was not in its usual spot in the center of the room. It was positioned near the open doorway, in the shade of the overhang. And her head, which was always fixed in a forward-facing, vacant stare, was turned. It was turned distinctly to the side, angled towards Alara. More than that, her left hand, the one that was typically limp and secured by a soft strap, was resting freely on the armrest. As he watched, her fingers twitched, not in a spasm, but in a soft rhythmic tap, almost in time with a hummed melody. Alistair's mind, trained to see patterns and anomalies, struggled to process the data. This was impossible. This contradicted every report, every expert opinion, every heartbreaking reality he had come to accept. His initial shock curdled into a hot, possessive fury. This woman, this cleaner, was interfering. She was performing some kind of amateur therapy, giving him false hope, endangering his fragile daughter with her sentimental nonsense. He shoved the doors open, the glass rattling in its frame. "What do you think you're doing?" he boomed, his voice echoing in the large space. Alara jumped, startled, her song cutting off abruptly. Lily flinched, a violent jerk of her entire body, and her head snapped back to its familiar, vacant forward stare. The life he had just witnessed vanished, as if it had never been. "Mr. Sterling," Alara said, rising to her feet. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. "You were just what?" he snarled, advancing on her. "Violating the explicit terms of your employment? Playing doctor with my daughter? Did you think I wouldn't notice?" The injustice of it all, the years of failure, the money spent, the experts confounded, all of it focused into a single point of rage directed at her. "She was responding to you," he accused, the words tasting like poison. "You were doing something." "I was humming," Alara said, her voice quiet but firm. "And she was listening." She turned her head, "Mr. Sterling." Her fingers were moving. "Lies," he spat. "I have the best doctors in the world telling me her condition is static. You think your humming is some kind of miracle cure?" He was ready to fire her, to have her thrown out, to erase this confusing, painful flicker of hope she had ignited. He took another step forward, his finger raised to point towards the exit. And then a sound pierced the tense air. It was a small, guttural noise, a whimper of distress. It came from Lily. Her face was crumpled in an expression of fear, and a single tear traced a path down her cheek. It was the first tear he had seen her shed since her mother's funeral. It was the first sound of emotion he had heard from her in 2 years. It stopped Alistair cold. His rage evaporated, replaced by a profound, gut-wrenching shock. The whimper was real. The tear was real. The fear in her eyes was real. He looked from his crying daughter to the calm, steady housekeeper. "She hummed," Alara repeated softly, her voice filled with a conviction that defied his skepticism. "She moved her fingers. She put her hand in water, and she felt it. She is in there, Mr. Sterling. You just have to find a way to reach her." Alistair stood frozen, caught between the world of clinical reports and the undeniable evidence of his own eyes and ears. The fortress he had built around his heart was cracking. The whimper had been a wrecking ball. He looked at Lily, whose gaze had now fixed on Alara with a desperate, pleading intensity. In that moment, the hierarchy of his world inverted. The expert was the housekeeper. The doctors were the blind ones. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a ragged whisper, stripped of all its corporate authority. "Show me!" The alliance was born not of trust, but of a desperate shared goal. Alistair, a man accustomed to control, had to cede a portion of it to his housekeeper, and the act chafed at his very nature. It was a covert operation, conducted in the hours when Nurse Ingrid was away, and Dr. Finch was not scheduled to visit. Alistair would watch, a silent sentinel, from the security feed in his study, his scotch forgotten on the desk beside him. He saw Alara bring a shallow tray of sand for Lily to touch, a feather to feel against her cheek, a sprig of rosemary for her to smell. He saw the infinitesimal responses, the slight widening of her eyes, the flare of her nostrils, the barely there tensing of her fingers. Each one was a data point that contradicted Finch's entire prognosis. One afternoon, he watched as Elara sat with a large sketchbook, drawing the birds in the garden. She spoke as she drew, describing the colors, the way the light hit their wings. She didn't ask Lily to participate, but she left the sketchbook and a box of colored pencils on a low table near the wheelchair. For 3 days they sat untouched. Then, on the 4th day, Alistair, glued to his monitor, saw Lily's hand slowly, painstakingly, reach out. Her fingers fumbled with the box, knocking it over. Pencils rolled across the floor. But she managed to grasp one, a bright blue one. With a tremor of effort that was agonizing to watch, she dragged the pencil across a blank page. It was a jagged, uncontrolled streak of blue, but it was a mark. She had made a mark. Alistair felt a surge of emotion so powerful it buckled his knees. He had to grip his desk to keep from crying out. He began to talk to Elara, not as an employer to an employee, but as a co-conspirator. He asked about her methods, her instincts. She spoke plainly, without jargon. "She's been locked away for her own protection," Elara explained one evening, as they stood in the quiet kitchen. The silence was a shield, but a shield can become a cage. I'm just showing her it's safe to come out. The simplicity of it was both infuriating and profound. As his trust in Elara grew, his suspicion of the established narrative deepened. He started asking her questions about the past, about the time leading up to Helena's death, and the onset of Lily's condition. Dr. Finch was managing both their treatments, he recounted, the memory painful. Helena's illness was so sudden. A rare neurological disorder, he said. Aggressive. There was nothing anyone could do. Lily saw her collapse. The trauma. That's what Finch said caused this. A complete psychosomatic shutdown. Elara listened, her expression thoughtful. Was she sick before that? Lily, I mean? No, Alistair said immediately. She was a perfectly healthy, vibrant little girl, always running, laughing. And her mother? Elara pressed gently. Was she ill for a long time? No, that was the horror of it. It came out of nowhere. Headaches, fatigue, then weakness in her limbs. It took her in less than 6 months. A thought, sharp and unwelcome, pierced Alistair's mind. The symptoms. Weakness in the limbs. He pushed it away. It was a coincidence. I need to understand, Elara said, her gaze direct. I need to see the medical files, not Dr. Finch's recent reports, the old ones, from before, from when she was well. And her mother's files, if you have them. It was an audacious request. Those files were private, locked away, monuments to his failure. But looking at Elara, at the quiet strength in her face, he knew she was right. The answer wasn't in the future, it was buried in the past. That night, for the first time in 2 years, Alistair Sterling unlocked the door to his late wife's study. The air was thick with the scent of her perfume, a floral note of jasmine that had clung stubbornly to the room. It was a time capsule of a life interrupted. Books lay open on tables. A half-finished letter sat on her writing desk. It was agonizing. Elara stood respectfully by the door, giving him a moment. He took a shuddering breath and crossed to a large mahogany filing cabinet. He pulled open a drawer labeled Medical. Inside were dozens of neatly organized files. Lily's were thick, chronicling a life of checkups and scraped knees before the final devastating reports from Dr. Finch. Helena's were slimmer, charting the terrifyingly rapid decline. They spread the files out on the large desk, the fluorescent light of the desk lamp casting harsh shadows. For hours they pored over test results, consultation notes, and prescriptions. It was Elara who found it. Tucked into the back of one of Helena's journals used as a bookmark was a folded lab report. It was from a different lab than the others, one Alistair didn't recognize. It was dated 3 months before Helena's death. It showed her blood work, and several figures were circled in red pen. "Look," Elara whispered, her finger pointing to a line item. "Arsenic. Lead. The levels are elevated. Not acutely toxic, but significant." Alistair stared at the page, his blood running cold. How had this been missed? He scanned the rest of the page. Stapled to the corner was a small prescription slip, a carbon copy. It was from Dr. Finch. It prescribed a custom compounded advanced vitamin and mineral support formula, and on the patient line, Finch had written two names, Helena and Lily Sterling. They were both taking it. The same vitamin supplement. The jagged blue line Lily had drawn on the sketchbook flashed in Alistair's mind. It was not a random mark. It was a scream. The world tilted and then shattered. Alistair, a man who commanded legions of analysts and researchers, now turned that formidable power onto a single, innocuous-looking vitamin supplement. He sent a sample of the pills, which were still being administered to Lily daily by Nurse Ingrid, to a private toxicology lab, one of the best in the world, with a single instruction. "I want to know every single molecule in this capsule." The results came back in less than 24 hours, delivered by a grim-faced courier to the mansion's front gate. Alistair and Elara read the report together in the cold silence of his study. The pills contained a complex, slow-acting neurotoxin, an obscure compound derived from a rare fungus, cleverly masked by a host of legitimate vitamins and minerals. The report detailed its effects: cumulative neurological damage, muscle weakness, fatigue, and in higher or prolonged doses, paralysis-like symptoms that perfectly mimicked certain aggressive motor neuron diseases. It was a poison designed to be invisible, to fly under the radar of standard medical tests. It was the perfect murder weapon, slow, cruel, and utterly baffling to the unsuspecting. Helena hadn't been struck down by a rare disease. She had been poisoned, and Dr. Finch, the trusted family friend, the pillar of support, had been delivering the poison to her and to her daughter every single day. The why was a question that clawed at Alistair's soul, a question more agonizing than the how. He tore his company's archives apart, dispatching a team of forensic accountants to dig into every interaction he'd ever had with Finch. The answer emerged from the dusty records of a corporate acquisition made a decade earlier. Finch had been a founding partner and the lead researcher in a small, promising biotech firm that Alistair's conglomerate had bought out. Alistair, in a move of typical, unsentimental efficiency, had deemed their primary research a dead end, stripped the company for its patents, and shut down Finch's passion project, costing the doctor his life's work and his personal fortune in the process. Alistair barely remembered the transaction. To him, it was just another line item on a quarterly report. To Finch, it had clearly been the defining betrayal of his life, and he had been plotting his revenge ever since. It was a revenge of breathtaking cruelty, not to kill Alistair, but to make him watch as everything he loved was slowly, inexplicably destroyed, to make him live in a gilded mausoleum haunted by his own perceived failures, while the architect of his misery offered him a comforting hand on the shoulder. Alistair collapsed into his chair, the report trembling in his hand. The guilt was a physical weight crushing the air from his lungs. He had done this. His ambition, his ruthlessness, his blindness. He had invited this monster into his home. He had handed his wife and child over to their executioner. "I didn't see," he whispered, the words a ragged confession. "I trusted him. I let him—" Elara placed a hand on his shoulder. Her touch was not one of pity, but of a profound and somber understanding. "You couldn't have known," she said, her voice steady. "He preyed on your trust. This isn't your fault, Mr. Sterling. This is his evil." It was then, in that moment of shared horror, that she finally told him about her own daughter, Sarah. She was 5, Elara said, her eyes looking at a past only she could see. She had a fever that wouldn't break. The doctor said it was just the flu. He told me I was an over-anxious mother. He wouldn't listen. He wouldn't run the tests. It was bacterial meningitis. By the time they figured it out, it was too late. The shared pain of a child lost to a doctor's failure, one through malice, the other through negligence, forged a bond between them stronger than steel. Alistair's grief was no longer a solitary confinement. It was a shared landscape. And in that landscape, a new feeling was taking root alongside the sorrow, a cold, hard, and focused rage. The time for grieving was over. The time for war had begun. The first move belonged to Alistair. Fueled by a righteous fury, he immediately contacted his legal team, initiating the process of revoking Dr. Finch's medical credentials and building a criminal case. He brought in a new hand-picked team of pediatric neurologists and toxicologists who descended on the mansion. They confirmed the lab's findings and immediately began a detoxification protocol for Lily. Nurse Ingrid, who was found to be merely a pawn, ignorant of the poison she was administering, was summarily dismissed. The house, for the first time in years, buzzed with a sense of purpose, of action. But Alistair, in his haste, underestimated the cunning of his enemy. Dr. Finch was not a man to be cornered easily. He had spent a decade planning his revenge. He had contingencies. Sensing the shift in the house, perhaps through a final call from the dismissed nurse, he acted with blistering speed. Before Alistair's lawyers could file their first motion, Finch launched a preemptive strike. He went to the press. He crafted a masterful, heartbreaking narrative. He was the dedicated doctor, fighting desperately to save a deeply traumatized child. The grieving father, Alistair Sterling, had become unstable, erratic, and had fallen under the spell of a manipulative and unqualified housekeeper. He painted Ilara as a charlatan, a predator who was practicing medicine without a license, filling a vulnerable man's head with fantasies of miracle cures for her own financial gain. He produced falsified notes documenting his concerns about Ilara's unorthodox and potentially harmful interactions with Lily. He twisted every bit of progress into an act of abuse. The story was explosive. "Billionaire brainwashed by housekeeper," screamed the headlines. The media, always eager to topple a titan, devoured the story. Finch didn't stop there. He filed an emergency petition with the family court, seeking to be appointed as Lily's medical guardian. He argued that Alistair was mentally unfit, and that Ilara was a clear and present danger to the child. He presented himself as the only one who could protect Lily from her own unstable father. And the court, faced with a respected doctor on one side and a salacious, chaotic story on the other, made the most cautious decision. They granted a temporary order. Dr. Finch's associates were given medical oversight of Lily Sterling, and Ilara Vance was served with a restraining order, legally barring her from coming within 500 feet of the child she had fought so hard to save. The day the order was served was the darkest yet. 2 police officers arrived at the mansion, their presence a vulgar intrusion. Ilara packed her small bag in a haze of disbelief, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. The last thing she saw as she was escorted out was Lily, watching from the solarium window, her small face a mask of confusion and terror. The moment the door closed behind Ilara, the light in Lily's eyes went out. The progress they had made, the fragile bridge they had built, collapsed. Lily retreated back into her silent prison, this time locked in not by poison, but by the cold, blunt trauma of the law. She became more still, more vacant than ever before. For Alistair, it was the ultimate nightmare. He had finally found the key to his daughter's recovery, only to have her snatched away and placed back into the hands of her tormentors' proxies. He was a king in his own home, now powerless, forced to watch as his daughter withered, waiting for a court date that seemed a lifetime away. The retaliation was complete, and it was devastating. The court order was a declaration of war. The cold, grieving billionaire was gone, burned away by a white-hot fury. In his place stood the man who had built an empire from nothing, a strategist, a fighter, a man who understood that battles were won not with emotion, but with overwhelming force. Aleister Stirling, who had once used his immense resources to acquire companies and crush competitors, now focused that entire arsenal on one man, Dr. Adrian Finch. He assembled a legal team that was the stuff of legend, the kind of lawyers who didn't just argue cases, but reshaped laws. He hired a team of the most tenacious private investigators in the country, former intelligence agents and forensic accountants, and gave them a simple, one-line directive. I want to own every secret Adrian Finch has ever had. While Aleister marshaled his forces, Elara found herself in a small, borrowed apartment, a world away from the sterile grandeur of the Stirling mansion. The restraining order was a physical wall, but it could not sever the connection she had with Lily. She lived in a state of suspended animation, her days marked by long, anxious calls with Aleister's legal team. She became the heart of their case. She recounted every detail of her time with Lily, her voice steady and precise as she described the first twitch of a finger, the first hum note, the jagged blue line on the paper. Her quiet observations, once dismissed as the fanciful notions of a housekeeper, were now the foundational evidence in a multi-million-dollar legal battle. She filled dozens of notebooks with her memories, her timeline providing the irrefutable proof of Lily's cognitive awareness and her connection to Elara, a connection Finch had claimed was a dangerous delusion. The investigators began to deliver. They unearthed Finch's precarious finances, the mountain of debt hidden behind his successful facade. They found the source of the neurotoxin, a disgraced chemist in South America whom Finch had paid handsomely through a series of shell corporations. They tracked the money trail from the biotech buyout a decade ago to the recent purchases of untraceable assets. Most importantly, they found a nurse, a woman who had worked at the clinic where Finch compounded his vitamins. She had quit months ago, deeply unsettled by Finch's secrecy and his unusual insistence on personally overseeing the Stirling prescription. She was terrified of the doctor, but faced with the choice between Aleister's legal protection and her own conscience, she agreed to testify. The preliminary hearings were a brutal slog. Finch's lawyers were masterful, painting him as a victim, a dedicated physician being persecuted by a powerful man's limitless wealth. They presented Aleister as an unhinged, grieving father, easily manipulated. The judge assigned to the case, a man named Arthur Harrington, was a veteran of the family court system, known for his cynical demeanor and his deep-seated skepticism of wealth and privilege. From the outset, it was clear he viewed Aleister with suspicion. He saw a father who, by his own admission, had been largely absent, now suddenly engaged in a vicious campaign against a doctor with a spotless record. He looked at Elara, a housekeeper with no formal qualifications, and saw an opportunist. His bias was a palpable force in the courtroom, tilting the scales of justice before the trial had even truly begun. The stage was set for a final public confrontation, a formal guardianship hearing that would decide not only Lily's fate, but the truth of the past 2 years. The courtroom was a study in contrasts, cold marble, dark wood, and the weight of the law pressed in on all sides. Aleister Stirling, in a perfectly tailored suit, looked less like a corporate titan and more like a soldier steeling himself for battle. Beside him, Elara Vance was an island of calm in a sea of tension, her simple dress a quiet statement of dignity against the legal pageantry. Across the aisle sat Dr. Adrian Finch, the picture of professional concern, his face a carefully constructed mask of sorrow for the family he claimed to be protecting. Presiding over it all was Judge Harrington, his face set in lines of permanent disapproval, his gaze sweeping over Aleister's expensive legal team with open disdain. The proceedings began, and it quickly became apparent that the judge's bias was not just a feeling, it was a weapon. He sustained Finch's lawyer's objections with a flick of his wrist and overruled Allister's with a weary sigh. He listened to the testimony from Finch's hand-picked experts, who spoke of Lily's profound catatonia and the dangers of emotional transference from an untrained caregiver. When Allister's lead attorney tried to introduce the toxicology reports, Finch's team argued they were obtained illegally, a product of corporate espionage, and the judge, to the shock of Allister's team, agreed to take their admissibility under advisement, effectively burying the most crucial piece of evidence. The nurse who had agreed to testify was intimidated on the stand, her testimony twisted until she sounded confused and unreliable. Hope began to drain from the room. Finch himself took the stand and delivered a virtuoso performance. He spoke of his deep affection for Helena, his profound sadness at her passing, and his unwavering commitment to her daughter. He described Ilara's actions as a well-meaning but catastrophic interference that had caused Lily immense psychological distress. He was smooth, believable, and utterly convincing. During a recess, Judge Harrington was overheard speaking to a bailiff. "A rich man's tantrum," he'd muttered, gesturing with his head towards Allister. "Thinks he can buy his way out of his own neglect by blaming the one man who actually cared. And he's got that poor woman so twisted up, she probably believes the fantasy herself." The bailiff repeated the comment to one of Allister's investigators, and the words landed like a death sentence. They were not just losing, they were being mocked. Desperation clawed at Allister. He saw Lily's future slipping away, condemned to the care of the man who had murdered her mother. His lead attorney, a formidable woman named Clara Rowe, saw it too. During their final huddle before the judge rendered his decision, she proposed a move of pure desperation. "We have to put Lily on the stand," she said, her voice low. Allister recoiled. "She can't speak, Clara. She's terrified." "What would that accomplish?" "It's not about speaking," Clara countered. "It's about showing. We have to show the judge the connection is real. We have to show him she is real." It was a wild, unpredictable gamble. It could backfire spectacularly, proving Finch's point about her catatonia. But they were out of options. Clara Rowe stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, before you make your ruling, we ask that you see the child for yourself. We ask for the opportunity to demonstrate Lily Sterling's cognitive awareness and her ability to communicate." Judge Harrington scoffed, an ugly, dismissive sound. "Communicate? Ms. Rowe, every expert, including your own, has testified that the child is nonverbal and largely unresponsive. What exactly do you propose she do? Blink once for yes? This is a courtroom, not a circus." The mockery was open now, dripping with contempt. He looked at Lily, a small black girl who had been wheeled in and seated at the back of the courtroom, and saw not a person but a prop in a legal drama. But the law and the faint hope of an appeal required him to at least entertain the motion. "Fine," he sighed, the word heavy with theatrical boredom. "You have 5 minutes. Let's see your miracle." The air in the courtroom grew thick with anticipation. Dr. Finch leaned back in his chair, a faint, confident smirk on his lips. This was the moment of his ultimate triumph, where his opponents would be publicly humiliated. Allister felt a cold dread wash over him. Ilara simply closed her eyes for a moment, sending a silent prayer into the universe. Lily was wheeled to the front of the courtroom, her small frame dwarfed by the judge's imposing bench. She looked fragile, her eyes wide with fear and confusion, fixed on the polished floor. Clara Rowe approached her gently. "Lily," she said, her voice soft, "no one is going to hurt you." She then placed 2 items on the wide table attached to Lily's wheelchair, setting them a few feet apart. One was a brand-new, expensive-looking doll with blonde hair and a silk dress, an item Finch's team had provided as a comfort object. The other was a small, worn wooden bird, its paint faded, its shape familiar. Lily's bird. "Lily," Clara said, her voice clear and steady, ringing through the hushed room, "we need your help. Can you please show the judge who helps you feel safe? Who is your friend?" The question hung in the air. Judge Harrington leaned forward, a cynical arch to his eyebrow. This was it, the pathetic final act. He expected nothing. For a full minute, Lily did not move. The silence stretched, becoming unbearable. Finch's smirk widened. Alistair's heart hammered against his ribs. Then it began. A tremor ran through Lily's right arm. Slowly, with an agonizing, visible effort that made every person in the room hold their breath, her hand lifted from her lap. It shook, the muscles weak from disuse and the lingering effects of the toxin, but it moved with undeniable intention. Her small hand hovered in the air for a moment, then moved deliberately past the shiny new doll. Her fingers, clumsy but determined, closed around the worn wooden bird. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Judge Harrington's cynical expression faltered, replaced by a flicker of stunned disbelief. But it wasn't over. From her seat in the front row, Elara, seeing the terror and effort in Lily's face, did the only thing she could think to do. She began to hum. It was their song, the simple, wordless lullaby, so quiet it was almost imperceptible. But Lily heard it. Her head, which had been bowed, slowly lifted. She turned, ignoring the judge, the lawyers, and her father, and looked directly at Elara. Her eyes, no longer vacant, were filled with a fierce, desperate love. She locked her gaze with Elara's. Then she opened her mouth. A small, rusty sound emerged, a voice that had not been used in 2 years. It was quiet, but in the dead silence of the courtroom, it was as loud as a cannon blast. "Home," Lily said. The single word shattered the last of Judge Harrington's cynicism, blew apart Dr. Finch's web of lies, and broke the dam of Alistair Sterling's grief. He let out a choked sob, the sound of a man seeing the sun after years in a dungeon. The courtroom erupted. The nurse who had been afraid to testify properly stood up and shouted, "He made me lie. It's all true." The judge slammed his gavel, but the sound was lost in the chaos of the truth, a truth delivered by a little girl and her wooden bird. Vindication was absolute. The aftermath was swift and decisive. In the face of Lily's testimony and the subsequent pandemonium, Judge Harrington, his face pale with shock and a dawning sense of his own profound error, immediately reversed his temporary orders. Dr. Finch, his mask of composure finally shattered, attempted to flee the courthouse, but was apprehended in the parking garage. The full weight of the justice system, now propelled by Alistair Sterling's fury and resources, came down upon him. The toxicology reports were admitted, the nurse's full confession was taken, and the financial evidence became irrefutable. Finch was charged with the murder of Helena Sterling and the attempted murder of her daughter, among a host of other crimes. His public disgrace was as spectacular as his deception had been intricate. The restraining order against Elara was dissolved before they even left the courthouse. The reunion between her and Lily was a quiet, sacred moment, away from the prying eyes of the press. There were no grand pronouncements, only tears and the tight, desperate hug of a child clinging to her lifeline. Alistair stood back and watched, his heart aching with a mixture of profound gratitude and regret. He saw in their bond the maternal love that had been stolen from his daughter, and he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that Elara was no longer just an employee. She was family. The months that followed were a period of intense healing. The Sterling mansion, once a cold monument to grief, was transformed. Sunlight was let in, the heavy drapes pulled back. The silence was replaced by the sounds of Lily's laughter as she worked with a team of dedicated physical therapists, her muscles slowly relearning the movements that had been stolen from her. The melodic notes of Elara's humming were a constant refrain, a soundtrack of recovery. Ilara worked alongside the therapists, her intuitive understanding of Lily's needs proving more valuable than any textbook. She taught Lily to trust her own body again, to find joy in the simple act of wiggling a toe or reaching for a flower. Alistair, too, was healing. He delegated the running of his empire to his most trusted lieutenants and devoted himself entirely to his daughter. He learned to be a father not in the abstract sense of providing, but in the tangible sense of being present. He sat on the floor and helped Lily with her exercises. He read to her for hours, and he listened, truly listened, to the words that began to flow from her, first in trickles, then in a steady, confident stream. His relationship with Ilara deepened, evolving from a partnership of necessity into a quiet, powerful love built on a foundation of shared trauma and mutual redemption. They were a strange, unlikely trio, a family forged not by blood but by a crisis that had stripped them all down to their essential truths. A year after the trial, Alistair hosted a gala. It wasn't a corporate event to celebrate a merger, but the launch of the Helena and Lily Foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to advocating for victims of medical malpractice and funding research into the detection of covert poisoning. The ballroom was filled with doctors, lawyers, and philanthropists, a testament to Alistair's renewed sense of purpose. He took the stage, not as the ruthless CEO, but as a grateful father. He spoke of his late wife's vibrant spirit and of his daughter's incredible courage. And then he turned to Ilara, who stood in the wings with Lily. "Success, I have learned, is not measured in stock prices or market shares," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It is measured in the moments of grace that save us from ourselves. I owe my life and my daughter's to the grace of one woman whose quiet observation and fierce heart taught me that the greatest strength is not in power, but in empathy." He called them to the stage. Lily, now walking with only the slightest limp, her face bright with a confidence that had seemed impossible a year ago, beamed at the cheering crowd. She carried a bouquet of wildflowers and, with a small, formal bow, presented them to Ilara. In that moment, under the warm lights, they were not a billionaire, a former housekeeper, and a victim. They were simply a family, whole and healed. The world had tested them with its cruelty, but they had answered with a resilience that proved true wealth was never about what you owned, but about the love you were willing to fight for. The greatest injustices often hide behind the most respectable masks, but the truth, no matter how quietly it speaks, will eventually find a way to be heard. Before we go, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video. And please, let us know in the comments where you're watching from around the world. We love hearing from you,